The dust cloud rose behind the stagecoach like a banner of desperation as it careened down the rutted trail toward Sweetwater, Texas. And Sarah, Mitchell pressed her hand against her belly, knowing that her secret would soon become impossible to hide. It was late September, 1878, and the mesquite trees stretched their gnarled branches across the landscape like the fingers of forgotten souls reaching for redemption. The coach lurched violently, throwing Sarah against the wooden side, and she bit back a cry of pain, not wanting to draw attention to herself among the other passengers who already eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A woman traveling alone was unusual enough without adding fuel to their speculation. When the stagecoach finally pulled into Sweetwater's main street, Sarah stepped down onto the dusty ground with her carpetbag clutched in both hands, surveying the town that would either become her salvation or her final judgment. The buildings looked weathered and tired, their paint peeling under the relentless Texas sun. But there was a church steeple rising above the mercantile, and that gave her a small measure of hope. She had exactly $17 sewn into the lining of her bag, a false letter of reference claiming she was a widow and a baby growing inside her that belonged to a man she had loved and lost in the cruelest way possible. The afternoon heat pressed down on her shoulders as she made her way toward the boarding house that someone in Austin had told her about, a place run by a widow named Mrs. Henderson, who sometimes took in women who needed work and lodging. Sarah's boots kicked up little clouds of dust with each step, and she could feel the eyes of the townspeople following her progress down the street. In a town this size, a stranger was an event worth noting, and she knew that by supper time, everyone would be speculating about who she was and what had brought her to Sweetwater. Mrs. Henderson turned out to be a solid woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that seemed to see right through Sarah's carefully constructed story. She stood in the doorway of her boarding house, arms crossed over her ample bosom, listening as Sarah explained that she was a widow looking for work, that her husband had died in a mining accident up north, and that she needed a fresh start. Mining accident, Mrs. Henderson repeated, her tone flat and skeptical. And you came all the way to Sweetwater, Texas, for your fresh start. I heard there might be work here, Sarah said, lifting her chin with what she hoped looked like determination rather than desperation. I can cook, clean, sew, and keep accounts. I am a hard worker, Mrs. Henderson, and I promise I would not be any trouble. The older woman's gaze dropped briefly to Sarah's midsection, and Sarah felt her cheeks flush hot. She was not showing yet, not really, but perhaps Mrs. Henderson had seen enough of life to recognize the subtle signs that Sarah herself had only recently accepted. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hammer of the blacksmith and the creak of the boarding house sign swaying in the breeze. I have one room available, Mrs. Henderson finally said. $3 a week, meals included. I expect my boarders to be respectable, quiet, and to attend church on Sundays. If you are looking for work, the Crawford Ranch has been advertising for someone to help their cook. Old Martha is getting on in years and cannot manage all the work alone, especially during the busy seasons. The pay is fair, and the Crawford family is decent folk. Relief flooded through Sarah so intensely that she felt her knees go weak. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I promise you would not regret giving me this chance. We will see about that, Mrs. Henderson said, stepping aside to let Sarah enter. The room is upstairs, second door on the left. Supper is at 6 sharp. Do not be late. That evening, Sarah sat at the long table in Mrs. Henderson's dining room with 5 other boarders, all men who worked various jobs around town. They were polite enough, tipping their hats and murmuring greetings, but Sarah kept her eyes on her plate and spoke only when directly addressed. She could feel their curiosity like a physical thing, but she had learned in the past few months that the less she revealed about herself, the safer she would be. After supper, she climbed the narrow stairs to her small room and sat on the edge of the thin mattress, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her exhaustion and fear. The room was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small wardrobe, and a single window that looked out over the back garden where Mrs. Henderson grew vegetables. Sarah pulled her carpetbag onto her lap and carefully unpicked the stitches that held her remaining money, counting it out on the faded quilt. $17 would not last long, even with room and board. She needed that job at the Crawford Ranch, and she needed it soon. That night, she lay in the darkness and allowed herself to think about Thomas for the first time in days. Thomas Brennan, with his quick smile and his promises of a future together. The man who had courted her in Philadelphia with flowers and poetry and declarations of eternal love. She had believed him completely, had given herself to him, with the trust of a woman who thought she knew what love looked like. When she had told him about the baby, she had expected joy, or at least surprise. Instead, she had seen his face close like a door slamming shut, and he had told her coldly that he was already engaged to someone else, a banker's daughter whose dowry would secure his political ambitions, and that Sarah had been nothing more than an entertaining diversion. The memory still had the power to make her feel sick with shame and anger. She had been such a fool, believing that a man like Thomas would actually marry someone like her, a shopkeeper's daughter with no connections and no fortune. After he had made it clear that he would not acknowledge the child or provide any support, Sarah had known that staying in Philadelphia was impossible. The scandal would have destroyed what remained of her family's reputation, and her father's heart condition meant that the shock might literally kill him. So, she had taken her savings, written a letter claiming she was going west to care for a sick aunt, and disappeared before her condition became obvious to anyone who knew her. Now she was here in Sweetwater, Texas, with a false identity and a growing belly and a determination to somehow build a life for herself and her child. It seemed impossible, but what other choice did she have? She pressed her hand against her stomach, feeling the slight curve that would soon become unmistakable, and whispered a promise into the darkness that she would protect this baby, that she would give her child a chance at a decent life, no matter what it cost her. The next morning dawned clear and hot, and Sarah dressed carefully in her most respectable dress, a dark blue calico that was starting to feel tight around the waist. She braided her honey-colored hair and pinned it up neatly, then studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Her green eyes looked too large in her pale face, and there were shadows beneath them from sleepless nights. But she looked presentable enough. She would have to be convincing when she spoke to whoever did the hiring at the Crawford Ranch. Mrs. Henderson gave her directions over breakfast, along with a long look that suggested she had her doubts about Sarah's story, but was willing to give her a chance anyway. "The ranch is about 3 miles west of town," she said, pouring Sarah a cup of strong coffee. "Follow the main road until you see the split-rail fence and the sign with the Crawford brand. Tell them I sent you and that you are looking for Martha. She will be the one to decide if you are suitable." Sarah thanked her and set out walking, grateful that the morning was still relatively cool. The road stretched out before her, rutted and dusty, winding between open rangeland dotted with cattle and the occasional stand of oak trees. She passed a few riders heading into town, cowboys who touched their hat brims politely but did not stop to speak. The landscape had a raw, untamed beauty that was nothing like the neat streets and brick buildings of Philadelphia, and Sarah found herself oddly drawn to the vast openness of it all. She had been walking for perhaps half an hour when she heard the sound of hoofbeats behind her, and she stepped to the side of the road to let the rider pass. Instead, the horse slowed to a walk beside her, and a man's voice said, "That is a long walk in this heat, ma'am. Can I offer you a ride?" Sarah looked up and found herself meeting a pair of steady gray eyes in a tanned, weathered face. The man was perhaps in his late 20s, with dark brown hair that needed cutting, and the lean, muscular build of someone who spent his days working hard under the sun. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who had been riding since childhood, and there was something in his expression that was both cautious and kind. "I am heading to the Crawford Ranch," Sarah said, keeping her voice polite but distant. "I appreciate the offer, but I can manage the walk." "The Crawford Ranch is still another 2 miles, the man said, swinging down from his saddle with a fluid motion. "And the sun is only going to get hotter. I work at the Crawford Ranch myself, so we are heading the same direction. No sense in you walking when there is a perfectly good horse here." He smiled slightly, and Sarah noticed that he had a small scar above his left eyebrow. "My name is James Holloway. I am one of the hands at Crawford's, and I promise I am respectable enough that Mrs. Henderson would approve of you accepting the ride." The mention of Mrs. Henderson's name was clearly meant to reassure her, and Sarah found herself relaxing slightly. "Sarah Mitchell," she said. "I am looking for work at the ranch, actually. I was told to speak to someone named Martha about a position in the kitchen." Something shifted in James Holloway's expression, a flicker of interest mixed with something else that Sarah could not quite identify. "Martha will be glad to hear it," he said. "She has been complaining for months that she cannot keep up with all the work, especially with Roundup coming soon. We will have extra hands to feed, and it has been wearing her down. He gestured toward his horse. Please, let me give you a ride. It will be easier on both of us, and you will make a better impression arriving fresh rather than dusty and exhausted. He had a point, and Sarah's feet were already aching in her tight boots. She nodded reluctantly, and James moved to help her mount. His hands were gentle but impersonal as he lifted her into the saddle, and then he swung up behind her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. The horse started forward at an easy walk, and Sarah tried to ignore her awareness of the solid warmth of James Holloway behind her. How long have you been in Sweetwater? James asked after a moment, his voice casual. I arrived yesterday, Sarah said. I am staying at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. She is a good woman, strict but fair, James said. You came from back east by your accent. Philadelphia, Sarah admitted, then bit her lip, wondering if she was revealing too much. I needed a change. James was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could almost feel him choosing not to ask the obvious questions. Sweetwater is a decent town, he finally said. Good people, for the most part. The Crawford family has owned the ranch for 20 years, and they treat their workers well. If you are hired, you will find it a good place to work. They rode in silence for a while, and Sarah found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, noticing the way the morning light caught the grass and turned it gold, the way the cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, the vast dome of blue sky overhead that seemed to go on forever. There was something both frightening and liberating about this open country, so different from the crowded streets and narrow buildings she had known all her life. The Crawford Ranch came into view gradually, first the split rail fences that marked the boundaries of the property, then the cluster of buildings that made up the ranch headquarters. There was a large main house built of stone and wood, its wide porch shaded by a roof that extended out over the front. Beyond it were several barns, a bunkhouse, corrals, and various outbuildings. The whole operation had an air of solid prosperity, well-maintained and organized. James rode past the main house and toward the back, where Sarah could see a separate building that was clearly the kitchen and cookhouse. Smoke rose from its chimney despite the heat, and Sarah could smell bread baking. James dismounted first, then helped Sarah down, his hands steadying her when she stumbled slightly. The kitchen is through that door, he said, pointing. Just knock and tell Martha that you are here about the job. She will take it from there. He hesitated, then added, Good luck, Miss Mitchell. I hope we will be seeing more of you. There was nothing improper in his tone or his manner, but Sarah felt color rise in her cheeks anyway. Thank you for the ride, Mr. Holloway. Just James, he said with a slight smile. We do not stand much on formality out here. He touched the brim of his hat, then led his horse away toward the barn, leaving Sarah standing alone in the dusty yard. She took a deep breath, smoothed her skirts, and knocked firmly on the kitchen door. After a moment, it swung open to reveal a stout woman with flour-dusted hands and a red face shiny with sweat. She looked to be in her 60s, with iron-gray hair escaping from beneath a kerchief, and sharp blue eyes that swept over Sarah with a practiced assessment. If you are selling something, we do not need it, the woman said briskly. I am not selling anything, Sarah said quickly. Mrs. Henderson in town told me you might need help in the kitchen. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I am looking for work. I can cook, bake, and manage a kitchen. I am a hard worker, and I am reliable. Martha's expression shifted from suspicious to interested. Can you make biscuits that do not taste like rocks? Yes, ma'am. Can you cook for 30 men without having hysterics? Yes, ma'am. Can you get up before dawn and work until after dark during busy seasons? Sarah thought of the baby growing inside her and wondered how long she would be able to maintain such a schedule, but she needed this job desperately. Yes, ma'am. Martha studied her for another long moment, then stepped back from the door. Come in then. Let us see what you can do. The kitchen was large and well equipped, with a massive iron stove, long work tables, shelves lined with pots and pans and supplies, and windows that let in plenty of light. It was sweltering hot from the stove, and Sarah could see why Martha looked so exhausted. The older woman pointed to a bowl of dough rising on one of the tables. That needs to be shaped into rolls for dinner, Martha said. Show me your technique. Sarah set down her carpetbag, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. She had learned to bake from her mother, who had believed that every young woman should know how to feed a family, and her hands remembered the motions even after months of not practicing. She shaped the dough into neat rolls with practiced efficiency. arranging them on baking sheets with just the right amount of space between each one. Martha watched with her arms crossed, occasionally grunting in what might have been approval. When Sarah finished, the older woman said, "All right, now let me see you make pie crust." For the next 2 hours, Martha put Sarah through a series of tests, having her prepare various dishes and demonstrate her skills. Sarah threw herself into the work with a kind of desperate determination, knowing that this might be her only chance at securing a position. By the time Martha finally called a halt, Sarah was flushed and sweating, but felt confident that she had proven her competence. "You will do," Martha said at last, and Sarah felt weak with relief. "The pay is $25 a month, plus room and board. You will have Sundays off after breakfast is cleared, and you will sleep in the small room off the kitchen. You will be expected to help with 3 meals a day for the ranch hands, plus separate meals for the Crawford family when they are entertaining. During roundup and branding season, the work will be harder and the hours longer. Can you handle that?" $25 a month was more than Sarah had dared hope for. It would be enough to save a little money to prepare for when the baby came. "Yes, ma'am, I can handle it." "Good. You can start tomorrow. Be here by 5 in the morning." Martha's expression softened slightly. "You look like you have had a hard time of it, girl. I do not know your story, and I am not going to pry, but you will find that ranch folk mind their own business for the most part. Do your work, keep to yourself if you want, and you will be left alone." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back rapidly. "Thank you, Mrs. Martha. You would not regret giving me this chance." "It is just Martha, no Mrs.," the older woman said. "Now go on back to town and get yourself settled. Tomorrow will come early." Sarah practically floated back to town, her exhaustion forgotten in her relief and gratitude. She had a job, a real job with decent pay and a place to live. It was more than she had dared hope for when she had left Philadelphia. Maybe, just maybe, she could actually make this work. That evening at supper, she told Mrs. Henderson about securing the position, and the older woman nodded with satisfaction. "The Crawford Ranch is a good place," she said. "You will be treated fairly there. Martha is a hard taskmaster, but she is also fair, and she would not tolerate anyone bothering you." The implication was clear, and Sarah felt grateful for it. In a place where she would be working primarily with men, it was good to know that there were protections in place. She went to bed that night, feeling more hopeful than she had in months, already planning what she would need to take with her to the ranch. The next morning, Sarah was up before dawn, her carpet bag packed with her few possessions. She had arranged with Mrs. Henderson to keep her room for the time being, paying a reduced rate to hold it as a backup in case things did not work out at the ranch. It seemed a sensible precaution, and Mrs. Henderson had agreed readily enough. James Holloway was waiting in front of the boarding house with his horse, and Sarah felt her cheeks warm at the sight of him. "Martha sent word that you might need a ride," he said, swinging down from the saddle. "Seems like you made quite an impression?" "I hope so," Sarah said, allowing him to help her mount. "I need this job." "Martha would not have hired you if she did not think you could do the work," James said, settling behind her in the saddle. "She has high standards." As they rode toward the ranch in the gray pre-dawn light, James told her a little about the operation. The Crawford Ranch ran about 2,000 head of cattle, employed roughly 20 permanent hands plus additional workers during busy seasons, and was owned by a man named Robert Crawford and his wife Ellen. They had 3 children, all of them grown and living elsewhere, and they ran the ranch with a combination of hard work and fair dealing that had earned them a solid reputation in the region. "Mr. Crawford is tough but honest," James said. "Mrs. Crawford is the real heart of the place, though. She makes sure everyone is treated right, and she is not afraid to step in if someone is causing trouble. You will meet them eventually, but mostly you will be working with Martha and seeing to the kitchen." "How long have you worked here?" Sarah asked, curious despite herself. 3 years, James said. "I drifted through after a bad winter up north, looking for work, and Mr. Crawford took a chance on me. I have been here ever since." There was something in his tone that suggested there was more to the story, but Sarah did not press. They all had their secrets, their reasons for ending up in places like Sweetwater, Texas, and she was not about to invite questions by asking too many herself. Martha was already in the kitchen when they arrived, the stove fired up and coffee brewing. She gave Sarah a brisk nod and immediately put her to work, showing her where everything was stored and explaining the routine. Breakfast for the ranch hands was served at 6 in the bunkhouse, a hearty meal of eggs, bacon, biscuits, and gravy. The Crawford family ate separately in the main house, usually a lighter meal unless they had guests. Sarah threw herself into the work, grateful to have something to focus on besides her fears and worries. The physical labor felt good, and there was a satisfaction in watching the ranch hands file through the bunkhouse dining room, filling their plates and eating with the hungry efficiency of men who had already been working for an hour or more. She caught sight of James among them, and he gave her a small nod of acknowledgement before turning his attention to his breakfast. The days quickly fell into a rhythm. Sarah rose before dawn, helped Martha prepare breakfast, cleaned up afterward, then immediately began preparations for the midday meal. After that was served and cleaned up, there was a brief respite before starting supper. In between, there were always other tasks: baking bread, churning butter, preserving vegetables from the ranch garden, mending kitchen linens, scrubbing floors. The work was endless and exhausting, but Sarah found a strange kind of peace in it. Martha was a demanding taskmaster, but she was also patient when Sarah did not know how to do something. And she had a dry sense of humor that made the long hours pass more quickly. The two women worked side by side in the hot kitchen, developing an easy companionship that did not require many words. Martha never asked about Sarah's past, and Sarah was profoundly grateful for that discretion. James made a habit of finding reasons to stop by the kitchen, usually with some request or question for Martha, but his eyes always sought out Sarah, and he always had a smile for her. Sarah found herself watching for him, looking forward to those brief moments of connection, even as she told herself it was foolish to let herself care. 2 weeks after she started working at the ranch, James appeared at the kitchen door just as Sarah was finishing the evening cleanup. Martha had already retired to her room, and Sarah was alone, her hands buried in dishwater, when she heard his knock. "Come in," she called, assuming it was one of the hands with a late request for food. James stepped inside, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "I saw the light still on and thought I would check that everything was all right." "Everything is fine," Sarah said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Just finishing up." James nodded, but he did not leave. Instead, he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly working up to saying something. Finally, he said, "Miss Sarah, I was wondering if you might like to take a walk with me on Sunday after breakfast. There is a pretty spot by the creek with some shade trees, and I thought you might enjoy getting away from the kitchen for a bit." Sarah's heart gave an odd little lurch. She knew she should say no, that getting involved with anyone was the last thing she needed. But there was something in James's earnest gray eyes that made her want to say yes. He had been nothing but kind and respectful to her, and the thought of spending time with him away from the ranch was unexpectedly appealing. "I would like that," she heard herself say, and James's face lit up with a smile that transformed his usually serious expression. "Good," he said. "I will come by after breakfast on Sunday then." After he left, Sarah stood in the quiet kitchen and pressed her hands against her belly, feeling guilty and confused. What was she doing, accepting invitations from a man when she was carrying another man's child? It was wrong, dishonest, and it could only end badly. But the loneliness that had been her constant companion for months seemed to recede a little when James was near, and she found herself craving that feeling like a person dying of thirst craves water. Sunday dawned clear and warm, and after breakfast was cleared away, Sarah changed into her best dress, a pale green cotton that she had altered the week before to accommodate her gradually expanding waistline. She was nearly 3 months along now, and while she was not obviously pregnant yet, her clothes were getting tighter, and her body was changing in ways that made her feel both awed and terrified. James was waiting for her outside the kitchen, dressed in clean clothes with his hair still damp from washing. He offered her his arm with an old-fashioned courtesy that made her smile, and they walked together away from the ranch buildings, following a path that wound through a stand of oak trees toward the sound of running water. The creek was a ribbon of clear water running over smooth stones, bordered by grass and wildflowers. James had been right about it being a pretty spot, peaceful and private, with the shade of the trees offering relief from the sun. He spread out a blanket he had brought and gestured for Sarah to sit, then settled down a respectful distance away. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the water and the birds. Then James said, "Tell me about Philadelphia. What was it like growing up there?" Sarah found herself talking about her childhood, carefully editing out anything that would reveal too much. She told him about her father's shop, about the busy streets and the tall buildings, about the markets and the theaters, and the sense of being surrounded by people at all times. James listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions, and gradually Sarah found herself relaxing, enjoying the simple pleasure of conversation with someone who seemed to truly care about her answers. "What about you?" she asked eventually. "Where did you grow up?" James's expression grew more guarded. "Missouri, originally. My family had a farm there. It did not work out, and I left when I was 18. I have been drifting ever since, taking work where I could find it, until I ended up here." There was clearly more to the story, but Sarah did not press. Instead, she said, "Do you like it here, at the ranch?" "I do," James said, and there was a note of surprise in his voice, as if he had not expected to feel that way. "I like the work, I like the people, and I like knowing what each day will bring. I have been thinking lately that maybe I am done drifting, that maybe it is time to put down roots somewhere." He looked at her directly. "Meeting you has made me think about that even more." Sarah felt her breath catch. "James, I know I am probably moving too fast," James said quickly. "I know we barely know each other, but I want you to know that I think about you all the time, Sarah. You are different from anyone I have ever met. There is a strength in you, a determination, and I find myself wanting to know everything about you." Sarah felt tears well up in her eyes. This was the moment when she should tell him the truth, when she should explain that she was not the respectable widow she pretended to be, that she was carrying another man's baby, that any feelings he had for her were based on a lie. But the words stuck in her throat, and instead she found herself saying, "I think about you too." James's face lit up, and he reached out to take her hand. His touch was gentle, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with a tenderness that made her heart ache. They sat there by the creek for another hour, talking and laughing, and Sarah allowed herself to pretend, just for a little while, that she was a normal woman being courted by a good man, that her life was not complicated by secrets and shame. As September gave way to October, Sarah's relationship with James deepened. They found time to be together whenever possible, usually on Sunday afternoons, but also in stolen moments during the week when James would stop by the kitchen or Sarah would bring water out to the men working in the corrals. Martha watched their growing attachment with a knowing eye, but said nothing, and the other ranch hands soon accepted their courtship as a natural development. Sarah knew she was being foolish, letting things progress, but she could not seem to help herself. James was everything Thomas had pretended to be: honest, hard-working, genuinely kind. He treated her with a respect that made her feel valued in a way she never had before. When he looked at her, she felt seen, truly seen, and it was intoxicating. But as her body continued to change, Sarah knew that time was running out. She was beginning to show now, a small but definite curve to her belly that she could no longer hide with clever alterations to her dresses. Soon it would be obvious to everyone what her condition was, and she would have to face the consequences of her deception. It was a cold morning in late October when Martha finally confronted her. Sarah was alone in the kitchen, kneading dough for the day's bread, when Martha came in and closed the door firmly behind her. "How far along are you?" Martha asked without preamble. Sarah's hands stilled in the dough, and she felt the color drain from her face. "I do not know what you mean." "Do not insult my intelligence, girl," Martha said, not unkindly. "I have had 6 children of my own. I know what a woman carrying looks like. How far along?" Sarah's shoulders sagged in defeat. "Almost 4 months." Martha nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "Does James know?" "No," Sarah whispered. "Nobody knows. I told everyone I was a widow, that my husband died in a mining accident, but that is not true. I was never married. The father is a man back in Philadelphia who wanted nothing to do with me or the baby." "And you ran away," Martha said. "I had no choice," Sarah said, feeling tears spill down her cheeks. "I could not stay there, could not face the scandal. I thought maybe out here, where nobody knew me, I could start over. I was going to say the baby was my late husband's, that it was born early. I thought I could make it work." "And now you have gone and fallen in love with James Holloway," Martha said with a sigh. Sarah wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of flour across her cheek. "I did not mean for that to happen. I tried to keep my distance, but he is so kind, so good, and I was so lonely. I know I should tell him the truth, but I am terrified of losing him." Martha was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah braced herself for anger or disgust. Instead, the older woman said, "James is a good man, one of the best I have known. He deserves the truth, Sarah, and you deserve the chance to find out if his feelings for you are strong enough to withstand it. You cannot build a life on lies, girl. It will only crumble eventually." "I know," Sarah said miserably. "I know you are right. I am just so frightened." "Being frightened is not a sin," Martha said gently. "We are all frightened sometimes. The question is what you do with that fear. You can let it rule you, or you can face it and deal with the consequences. I think you are stronger than you give yourself credit for." Sarah wanted to believe that, but the thought of telling James the truth made her feel physically ill. What if he looked at her with disgust? What if he turned away from her, called her terrible names, told everyone at the ranch about her deception? She had seen how society treated women in her position, had watched from the sidelines as friends and acquaintances were shunned and ruined for far less. "Tell him," Martha said firmly. "Tell him soon, before someone else notices and the decision is taken out of your hands. Give him the chance to surprise you." That evening, Sarah sent word to James asking him to meet her after supper at the creek. She spent the rest of the day in a state of sick anxiety, barely able to focus on her work. Martha kept giving her encouraging looks, but Sarah felt beyond encouragement. She was about to risk everything, to potentially destroy the first real happiness she had found in months, and the fear was paralyzing. James was waiting for her when she arrived at the creek, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He smiled when he saw her, that warm, open smile that made her heart ache, and moved to take her hand. Sarah pulled away, and his smile faded. "Sarah, what is wrong?" "I need to talk to you," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me say it all before you respond." James's expression grew serious, concerned. "All right, I am listening." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to gather her courage. The words seemed to stick in her throat, but she forced them out, knowing that if she did not do this now, she never would. "I have not been honest with you, James. I am not who I said I was. I am not a widow. I was never married. I came to Sweetwater because I was running away from Philadelphia, from a scandal that would have destroyed my family." She saw James's expression shift, becoming guarded, and her heart sank. But she pressed on, determined to tell him everything. "There was a man, Thomas Brennan. He courted me, told me he loved me, promised me a future. I believed him. I thought we would be married. But when I told him I was expecting his child, he told me he was engaged to someone else, someone more suitable, and that I had been nothing but a temporary amusement to him." The words were coming faster now, tumbling out in a rush. "I could not stay in Philadelphia. The shame would have killed my father, ruined my mother. So I took my savings and I came west, thinking I could start over, that I could pretend to be a widow and raise my child alone. I never meant to meet you, to develop feelings for you. But I did, and I have been lying to you every day since, and you deserve to know the truth." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, and said the words she had been dreading. "I am carrying another man's baby, James. I am almost 4 months along, and soon everyone will be able to see it. I understand if you are angry, if you want nothing more to do with me. I just needed you to hear the truth from me before you heard it from someone else." The silence that followed felt endless. James stood very still, his face unreadable in the fading light. Sarah watched him, her heart breaking, waiting for him to turn away, to tell her she disgusted him, that he never wanted to see her again. Instead, James took a step toward her, then another, until he was standing close enough that she could see the emotions warring in his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was rough with feeling. "Are you all right? Did that man hurt you?" Of all the responses Sarah had expected, that was not one of them. She stared at him in confusion. "What? Did he hurt you?" James repeated, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Did he force himself on you?" "No," Sarah said quickly. "No, it was not like that. I consented. I thought we were in love, that we would be married. I was a fool, James, a naive fool who believed a liar's promises." "You were not a fool," James said fiercely. "He was a scoundrel who took advantage of your trust. That is not the same thing." Sarah shook her head, more tears spilling down her cheeks. "You do not understand. I am ruined, James. I am carrying a bastard child. In the eyes of the world, I am worthless, shameful. You should be disgusted by me." James reached out and cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. His gray eyes were blazing with an intensity that took her breath away. "I am not disgusted by you, Sarah. I am furious at the man who did this to you, but I could never be disgusted by you. You are the bravest, strongest woman I have ever met. You left everything you knew to protect your family and your child. You have been working yourself to exhaustion to build a new life. How could I be anything but in awe of you?" "But the baby," Sarah whispered. "I am carrying another man's baby." James's expression softened, and he moved one hand down to rest gently on her belly. "Then I will love you both the same," he said simply. Sarah felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. "What?" "I love you, Sarah," James said, his voice steady and sure. "I think I have loved you since the first moment I saw you walking down that dusty road, determined and frightened and refusing to give up. If you will have me, I want to marry you. I want to give you and your baby a home, a family, a future. I want to be the father your child deserves, the husband you deserve." Sarah could not seem to make sense of his words. "You cannot mean that. You cannot possibly want to marry a woman who is carrying another man's child." "Why not?" James challenged. "The baby is innocent in all of this, and so are you. You loved unwisely and paid a terrible price for it. But that does not make you less worthy of love, Sarah. It does not make you less deserving of happiness. If anything, it makes me love you more, because I know what it cost you to tell me the truth just now, and you did it anyway." "James, you are not thinking clearly," Sarah said desperately, even as hope began to flicker in her chest. "People will talk. They will say terrible things about me, about you for marrying me." "Let them talk," James said with a shrug. "I have never much cared what people thought of me. The people who matter, the people at this ranch, they will accept you because I do, and anyone who does not can go straight to hell." Sarah laughed, a sound somewhere between a sob and genuine amusement. "You are insane." "Maybe," James agreed with a small smile, "but I am also completely serious. Marry me, Sarah. Let me be a father to your baby. Let me show you what real love looks like, the kind of love that does not disappear when things get difficult." Sarah looked up at him, this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to speak. He was offering her everything she had thought she had lost forever: safety, love, a home for her child. It seemed impossible, too good to be true, and yet the sincerity in his eyes was undeniable. "Are you absolutely certain?" she whispered. "Once we do this, there is no going back. People will assume the baby is yours, or they will know the truth and judge us both. Either way, it will affect your life forever." "I am more certain of this than I have been of anything in my life," James said. "Say yes, Sarah, please." Sarah felt something break open inside her, all the fear and shame and loneliness of the past months cracking apart to let in a rush of hope and joy. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "Yes, I will marry you." James pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, and Sarah clung to him, finally allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. They stood there by the creek as the stars began to appear overhead, two people who had been lost finding their way home in each other. The next day, James went to speak with Mr. Crawford, asking permission to marry Sarah and requesting a small cabin on the edge of the ranch property that had been used for storage. Mr. Crawford, who was a shrewd judge of character, agreed readily, saying that he had noticed the attachment between his ranch hand and his cook's assistant and thought it a good match. Mrs. Crawford was equally supportive, and within days the small cabin was being cleaned out and prepared for occupancy. Martha helped Sarah sew a simple dress for the wedding, a cream-colored cotton with a high waist that would accommodate her growing belly. The older woman worked with quiet efficiency, occasionally patting Sarah's hand or offering words of encouragement. "You are doing the right thing," she said more than once. "James is a good man, and he will be a good father." The wedding took place on a Sunday afternoon in late October in the small church in Sweetwater. The pastor, Reverend Matthews, was a kind-faced man in his 50s who had heard enough confessions in his life not to be shocked by Sarah's situation. When James explained that Sarah was a widow and that the child she carried had been conceived before her husband's death, the Reverend accepted the story without question, perhaps suspecting the truth, but choosing not to press the issue. The ceremony was simple, but heartfelt. Sarah stood beside James in her new dress, her hand trembling in his, and spoke her vows with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. When James slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring he had purchased with his savings in town, Sarah felt tears stream down her face. This man, this good, honest man, was choosing her, choosing to stand beside her despite everything, and she vowed silently that she would spend the rest of her life being worthy of that gift. Martha and the Crawfords served as witnesses, and after the ceremony, Mrs. Crawford hosted a small celebration at the ranch. The other ranch hands offered their congratulations, genuinely happy for James, and if anyone suspected that the timeline of Sarah's widowhood and pregnancy did not quite add up, they kept their speculation to themselves. That night, Sarah and James moved into their small cabin, a simple structure with one large room, a fireplace, and a loft for sleeping. James had spent the past week furnishing it with a bed, a table, and chairs, shelves, and various other necessities. It was not fancy, but it was clean and sturdy. And when Sarah stood in the middle of the room and looked around, she felt a sense of home that she had not experienced since leaving Philadelphia. James was careful with her that night, gentle and patient, giving her time to adjust to the reality of being married. They lay together in the darkness of the loft, Sarah's head resting on James's chest, his hand splayed protectively over her belly. "I am going to do everything I can to make you happy," James murmured into her hair. "I promise you that." "You already have," Sarah whispered back. "You gave me hope when I thought I had none left. You gave me and my baby a future." "Our baby," James corrected softly. "From this moment on, this child is ours, Sarah. I will never think of them as anything less than my own." Sarah felt fresh tears slip down her cheeks, but they were tears of relief and gratitude rather than sorrow. She had been so certain that her mistake with Thomas had ruined her life forever, that she would spend the rest of her days alone and shamed. Instead, she had found a man who loved her not in spite of her circumstances, but perhaps, in some ways, because of them. James saw her strength, her courage, and he valued those things more than some abstract notion of purity or propriety. As the weeks passed, Sarah settled into married life with a sense of deep contentment. She continued to work in the kitchen alongside Martha, though James insisted she take more breaks and not work as many hours. Her belly continued to grow, and soon there was no hiding her pregnancy from anyone. The ranch hands accepted it without comment, treating her with the same respect they always had, perhaps even a bit more protectively now that she was James's wife. James proved to be everything Sarah could have hoped for in a husband. He was attentive without being overbearing, affectionate without being demanding, and he clearly relished the prospect of becoming a father. In the evenings, they would sit together in their cabin, James's hand resting on Sarah's belly, feeling the baby move and kick. He would talk to the child, telling stories about the ranch, about the wide Texas sky, about all the things they would do together when the baby was old enough. November brought cooler weather and preparations for Thanksgiving. Martha recruited Sarah to help with the elaborate meal that would be served to everyone on the ranch, a tradition Mrs. Crawford insisted on maintaining every year. Despite her growing belly and increasing tiredness, Sarah threw herself into the work, grateful to be part of something larger than herself, to belong to this community that had accepted her so completely. On Thanksgiving Day, the ranch hands gathered in the bunkhouse for a feast that included roasted turkeys, ham, mountains of potatoes and vegetables, pies of every description, and bread still warm from the oven. James sat beside Sarah at the long table, his hand occasionally finding hers under the table, squeezing gently. When Mr. Crawford stood to say grace, thanking God for the bounty of the land and the blessing of good people to share it with, Sarah felt tears well up in her eyes. 6 months ago, she had been alone and terrified, convinced her life was over. Now she was surrounded by people who cared about her, married to a man who loved her, and preparing to welcome a child who would be raised with love and security. After the meal, Mrs. Crawford pulled Sarah aside, pressing a small package into her hands. "For the baby," she said with a warm smile. "I made these for my own children, and I thought you might like to have them." Inside the package were tiny knitted garments, impossibly small and soft, booties, a cap, a blanket. Sarah looked up at Mrs. Crawford with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Thank you so much. You are part of our family now," Mrs. Crawford said, patting Sarah's hand. "And that baby will be loved by all of us." December arrived with cold winds and occasional frost, and Sarah found herself moving more slowly, her belly now prominent enough that it affected her balance and made some tasks difficult. Martha finally insisted that Sarah stop working full-time in the kitchen, allowing her to help only with lighter tasks and insisting she rest more. James was even more protective, fussing over her in a way that was both endearing and occasionally frustrating. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Sarah told him one evening when he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of laundry. "I know," James said, taking the basket from her anyway. "But you are carrying precious cargo, and I intend to make sure both of you stay safe and healthy." Sarah could not really argue with that, and truthfully, she was tired more often than she cared to admit. The baby was active now, moving and kicking at all hours, and while she loved feeling those movements, they also made sleeping difficult. James would rub her back and her feet without being asked, and would often read aloud to her in the evenings from books he borrowed from Mrs. Crawford's library. Christmas brought more celebrations, and Sarah found herself the recipient of numerous gifts from the people at the ranch. Mrs. Crawford gave her fabric for making more baby clothes. Martha contributed a beautiful cradle that her late husband had built decades before. The ranch hands pooled their money to buy a rocking chair, which they presented with bashful grins and mumbled congratulations. James's gift to her was a music box, something he had ordered from a catalog and had shipped all the way from St. Louis. When Sarah opened it, the delicate melody that emerged made her cry. "It is beautiful," she whispered, watching the tiny ballerina spin inside. "I wanted you to have something just for you," James said softly. "Something that had nothing to do with the baby or the ranch or work. Something that was just about you being special to me." That night, lying in their bed with James's arms around her and the baby moving inside her, Sarah sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. She had come to Texas expecting nothing but hardship and loneliness. Instead, she had found a home, a family, and a love deeper than anything she had ever imagined possible. January 1879 arrived cold and clear, and Sarah entered her final months of pregnancy with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Martha had helped her prepare for the birth, teaching her what to expect and reassuring her that the pain would be bearable and temporary. Mrs. Crawford had arranged for the local midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Thompson, to attend the birth, and Sarah felt as prepared as she could be for what was to come. James became even more attentive as Sarah's due date approached, barely letting her out of his sight when he was not working. He built a beautiful cradle in his spare time, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk, and Sarah would often find him standing beside it with a thoughtful expression, as if imagining the baby who would soon occupy it. One evening in mid-February, Sarah woke in the middle of the night with a sharp pain in her lower back. At first, she tried to ignore it, not wanting to wake James, but as the pain grew stronger and more regular, she realized that the baby was coming. She shook James awake, and he immediately sprang into action, helping her dress and then running through the darkness to fetch Mrs. Thompson and Martha. The labor lasted through the night and into the following day. Long hours of pain and effort that tested Sarah's strength in ways she had never imagined. James stayed with her the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement even when she was certain she could not endure another moment. Martha and Mrs. Thompson moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, doing whatever needed to be done, and their calm competence helped Sarah stay focused. Finally, as the sun began to set on the second day, Sarah gave one last tremendous push and felt the baby slip from her body. The room filled with the sound of a newborn's cry, lusty and strong, and Sarah fell back against the pillows, exhausted but flooded with relief. "It is a boy," Mrs. Thompson announced, holding up the squalling infant. "A fine, healthy boy." Sarah watched through tears as the midwife cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a blanket, then placed him in her arms. The infant was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that squinted up at her with what looked like indignation at being thrust into the cold world. He was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever seen. James leaned over them, his face filled with wonder, and gently touched the baby's tiny hand. The infant immediately grasped James's finger with surprising strength, and Sarah saw her husband's eyes fill with tears. "Hello, son," James whispered. "Welcome to the world." In that moment, Sarah saw all of James's promises made real. He was not looking at this baby and seeing another man's child. He was looking at their son, the child he had chosen to love and raise as his own. The past did not matter to him, only the future they would build together. "What should we name him?" Sarah asked softly. James thought for a moment, then said, "What about Benjamin? Benjamin James Holloway." Sarah tested the name on her tongue and nodded. "Benjamin, I like that. It means son of my right hand, does it not? A beloved son." "He is that," James said fervently. "He is definitely that." Over the next few weeks, Sarah recovered from the birth, while James took on every task he could to make her life easier. He brought her meals, changed Benjamin's diapers, walked the floor with the crying infant in the middle of the night, and generally proved himself to be everything Sarah had believed he would be as a father. The ranch hands stopped by to see the baby, offering congratulations and small gifts, treating James as any new father would be treated. Mrs. Crawford was a frequent visitor, often bringing food or offering to watch Benjamin so Sarah could rest. "He is a beautiful baby," she said one afternoon, holding Benjamin with the practiced ease of someone who had raised 3 children of her own. "He has your coloring, Sarah, but I think he has James's chin." Sarah felt a flicker of anxiety, wondering if Mrs. Crawford suspected the truth, but the older woman's expression held only warmth and genuine affection. Whether she knew or not, she was choosing to accept the story they had presented, and Sarah was grateful for that discretion. As winter gave way to spring, Benjamin grew stronger and more alert, his dark eyes beginning to focus on the world around him. Sarah would sit in her rocking chair, nursing him and humming softly, while James worked on various projects around the cabin. In the evenings, James would hold his son, talking to him about everything and nothing, and Sarah would watch them with a heart so full it felt like it might burst. One evening in late March, as they sat together after putting Benjamin down to sleep, James said, "Are you happy, Sarah? Truly happy?" Sarah reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I am happier than I ever thought possible," she said honestly. "When I left Philadelphia, I thought my life was over. I thought I would spend the rest of my days alone, carrying the burden of my shame. But you changed everything, James. You gave me hope. You gave me love. You gave my son a father." "Our son," James corrected gently, as he always did. "Benjamin is ours, Sarah. I need you to believe that." "I do believe it," Sarah said, and she realized it was true. In the 2 months since Benjamin's birth, she had watched James transform into a devoted father, and she had seen Benjamin respond to him with the same instinctive trust that any infant shows toward the person who cares for them. Whatever biological connection Benjamin might have to Thomas Brennan, it was James who was his real father in every way that mattered. As the months passed, their life settled into a comfortable routine. Sarah returned to working part-time in the kitchen, bringing Benjamin with her, and Martha delighted in having a baby to fuss over. The ranch hands competed for the chance to hold him, and Benjamin grew up surrounded by people who loved him. James continued to work hard, and his dedication and skill did not go unnoticed by Mr. Crawford, who gradually gave him more responsibility and a corresponding increase in pay. By Benjamin's first birthday in February 1880, James and Sarah had saved enough money to add a second room to their cabin, giving them more space and privacy. James did most of the construction himself, with help from some of the other ranch hands, and Sarah spent her free time making curtains and planning how to furnish the new space. It felt like putting down roots, like building something permanent and lasting. Benjamin's first birthday party was a major event on the ranch, with Mrs. Crawford insisting on baking a special cake and all the ranch hands turning out to celebrate. Sarah stood beside James, watching their son smash his chubby hands into his cake with obvious delight, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what she had dreamed of all those months ago when she had fled Philadelphia. A family, a home, a place where she belonged. That night, after Benjamin was asleep and they were lying in bed together, James said, "I have been thinking about something." "What is that?" Sarah asked, trailing her fingers lazily across his chest. "I want to have more children with you," James said. "I love Benjamin more than life itself, but I want him to have brothers and sisters. I want to fill our home with children, Sarah, if you are willing." Sarah felt a surge of emotion at his words. The fact that James wanted to have children with her, biological children who would be unquestionably his, felt like the final proof that he truly saw Benjamin as his own. "I would like that too," she said softly. "I would like that very much." In May of 1880, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again, and James's joy was uncontainable. He told everyone who would listen that they were expecting, and he treated Sarah with even more care and protectiveness than he had during her pregnancy with Benjamin. This time, there was no fear or shame associated with the pregnancy, only happiness and anticipation. Their daughter, Mary Ellen, was born in January 1881, a tiny, delicate baby with James's gray eyes and Sarah's honey-colored hair. Benjamin, now almost 2, was fascinated by his new sister, constantly wanting to touch her and help take care of her. James was equally smitten, and Sarah often found him holding Mary Ellen and singing to her in a soft, off-key voice that made her smile. 2 years later, in March 1883, they welcomed another son, Thomas James, and their small cabin felt full to bursting with love and laughter and the chaos of 3 young children. James had been promoted to foreman by then, a position that came with more pay and more authority, and they were able to expand the cabin again, adding a proper bedroom for the children and a larger kitchen. Sarah sometimes thought about her old life in Philadelphia, about the father and mother she had left behind, and she felt a pang of guilt and sadness. She had written to them once years ago, a carefully worded letter saying she was well and married and happy, but she had never given them a return address, too afraid that contact with her past might somehow threaten the future she had built. She hoped they were well, hoped they had forgiven her for disappearing, but she could not risk going back or inviting them into her new life. In August 1885, Sarah gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Samuel and Elizabeth. The ranch erupted in celebration, as twins were considered especially lucky, and James walked around in a state of dazed happiness for weeks. With 5 children now, their cabin had become too small, and Mr. Crawford offered them a larger house on the ranch property, one that had been built for the previous foreman who had retired the year before. The new house had 4 bedrooms, a proper kitchen and dining room, and a wide front porch where Sarah could sit and watch the children play. It felt almost too grand for a ranch foreman's family, but Mrs. Crawford insisted they take it, saying that James had earned it through his years of loyal service. Sarah decorated it lovingly, making curtains and quilts, hanging pictures, turning it into a real home. Benjamin grew into a thoughtful, serious boy who loved horses and followed his father everywhere. He never questioned that James was his father, and Sarah was profoundly grateful for that. By the time he was 7 or 8, the circumstances of his birth had been largely forgotten by everyone, and he was simply one of the Holloway children, loved and accepted by the entire ranch community. Mary Ellen was gentle and sweet-natured, always ready with a hug or a kind word. Thomas was rambunctious and adventurous, constantly getting into mischief. The twins, Samuel and Elizabeth, were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and seeming to communicate in a language only they understood. Together, they filled the house with noise and laughter and an energy that left Sarah exhausted but deeply happy. Martha, now in her 70s, had retired from her position as head cook, but she remained a constant presence in their lives, babysitting the children and offering advice when Sarah needed it. She became like a grandmother to the children, and they adored her. Mrs. Crawford also maintained a close relationship with the family, often inviting them to the main house for Sunday dinners and treating the children with the same affection she showed her own grandchildren. As the years passed, Sarah and James's love only deepened. They had weathered the challenges of raising a large family, of drought years and harsh winters, of childhood illnesses and financial worries, and through it all, their partnership had remained strong. James never once made Sarah feel like Benjamin was less than his other children, and Sarah made sure that all her children understood how extraordinary their father was. One evening, in the fall of 1890, when Benjamin was 11 and little Elizabeth and Samuel were 5, Sarah and James sat together on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. The children were playing in the yard, their shouts and laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Taking on me and Benjamin all those years ago?" James turned to look at her, his gray eyes filled with so much love that Sarah felt her breath catch. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "You and our children are the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah. I was drifting before I met you, lost and lonely and not even knowing it. You gave my life purpose and meaning. You gave me a family. How could I ever regret that?" "I just want you to know how grateful I am," Sarah said, tears welling in her eyes. You saved me, James. You saved us both. You took a terrified pregnant woman and made her your wife. You took another man's baby and made him your son. You could have had an easier life, married someone without my complications." "I did not want an easier life," James said, reaching for her hand. "I wanted you. I wanted Benjamin. I wanted exactly the life we have built together. Yes, it has been hard sometimes. Yes, there have been challenges. But Sarah, every moment has been worth it. Every single moment." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their children play as the sun sank below the horizon. Benjamin was teaching Thomas how to rope a fence post, demonstrating with the patient competence he had learned from James. Mary Ellen was pushing the twins on a makeshift swing James had built. They were healthy, happy, loved. They had a home, a community, a future full of possibilities. "I love you," Sarah whispered. "I love you so much." "I love you too," James said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Always." The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Benjamin grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like James, with a natural ability with horses that made him invaluable on the ranch. When he turned 18, Mr. Crawford offered him a position as one of the ranch hands, and Benjamin accepted with pride. Sarah watched him ride out with the other men on his first day and felt tears stream down her face, overwhelmed with gratitude that her son had grown up with such a strong, loving father figure to guide him. Mary Ellen developed a passion for teaching and announced at 15 that she wanted to become a school teacher. Sarah and James saved diligently to send her to the Teachers College in Austin, and when she returned a few years later with her certificate, she took a position at the small school in Sweetwater. The entire town celebrated her achievement, and Sarah felt a fierce pride in her daughter's accomplishment. Thomas showed an interest in ranching that rivaled his older brothers, and by the time he was 16, he was working alongside Benjamin and James, learning every aspect of the operation. The twins, Samuel and Elizabeth, were still young, but showed signs of developing their own unique talents and interests. In 1896, when Benjamin was 17, he began courting a young woman named Rebecca Miller, the daughter of the town's doctor. Sarah watched their courtship with mixed emotions, remembering her own young love for Thomas Brennan and how badly that had ended. But Rebecca was a sweet, sensible girl, and Benjamin approached the relationship with the same thoughtful seriousness he brought to everything else. When he asked for permission to marry her a year later, James gave his blessing readily. The wedding took place in the same church where Sarah and James had married nearly 20 years before. Sarah sat in the front pew, James's hand warm in hers, and watched Benjamin stand beside Rebecca and speak his vows. He looked so much like James in that moment, tall and serious and full of quiet determination, that Sarah felt her heart might burst with love. After the ceremony, at the celebration held at the ranch, Benjamin pulled Sarah aside for a private moment. "I want to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything, for giving me life, for bringing me here, for giving me the best father a son could ask for." Sarah felt tears spill down her cheeks. "You have always been such a gift, Benjamin. From the moment you were born, you have been nothing but a blessing to me." "I know my story is complicated," Benjamin said quietly. "I am not a child anymore, Mother. I can do the math, can figure out that you were not married to Father when I was born. But none of that matters to me. He is my father in every way that counts, and you are the strongest woman I have ever known. I am proud to be your son." Sarah pulled him into a fierce embrace, holding him tightly. "And I am proud to be your mother. You have grown into such a fine man, Benjamin. I know you are going to have a wonderful life with Rebecca." As the years continued to flow by, Sarah and James watched their children grow and flourish. Mary Ellen married a young rancher from a neighboring property, and eventually had 3 children of her own. Thomas took over more and more responsibilities at the Crawford Ranch, as James began to slow down in his 50s, showing the same dedication and skill his father had always demonstrated. The twins, Samuel and Elizabeth, both pursued education beyond what was common in the area, Samuel becoming a lawyer, and Elizabeth a nurse. Benjamin and Rebecca settled on a small ranch of their own, purchased with money Benjamin had saved, and a generous wedding gift from the Crawfords. They had 4 children in quick succession, and Sarah delighted in being a grandmother, spending hours holding and playing with her grandchildren, telling them stories about the ranch and about their family. Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1897 at the age of 83. The entire ranch mourned her loss, and Sarah felt it particularly keenly. Martha had been the first person to truly see her, to understand her situation and offer help without judgment. She had been a friend, a mentor, and a surrogate mother, and Sarah missed her terribly. Mr. and Mrs. Crawford both passed away within a year of each other in the early 1900s, and their children decided to sell the ranch rather than continue operating it. James, by then in his 50s and well-respected throughout the region, was offered the position of ranch manager by the new owners, a cattle company based in Fort Worth. It was a significant promotion with excellent pay, and James accepted, ensuring the security of their future. As Sarah and James moved into their later years, they found themselves with more time to simply enjoy each other's company. The children were grown and established in their own lives. The grandchildren were numerous and thriving, and there was a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction in looking back at what they had built together. One evening, in the summer of 1905, Sarah and James sat together on their porch, much as they had done countless times over the years. Sarah was now 47, and James was 52. They had been married for nearly 27 years, and Sarah could not imagine her life without him. "Do you remember that first day we met?" James asked suddenly. "When I found you walking down that road toward the ranch?" "Of course I remember," Sarah said with a smile. "I thought you were so kind, offering me a ride. I was terrified of you seeing through my story." "I think I fell in love with you right then," James said. "Something about the way you held yourself, determined and brave despite being so obviously frightened. I wanted to know everything about you. And when I told you the truth about Benjamin," Sarah said softly, "I was certain you would turn away, that you would tell me I was ruined and shameful. I told you then, and I will tell you now," James said, taking her hand. "You were never ruined, Sarah. You were hurt by a man who did not deserve you, but that never made you less worthy of love. If anything, your strength in the face of such adversity made you more remarkable." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks, as they so often did when James spoke to her with such tender honesty. "You changed my life, James Holloway. You took a broken woman and her baby and gave us a home, a family, a future. You loved us both the same, just like you promised." "It wasn't a hard promise to keep," James said with a smile. "Benjamin was easy to love. He was part of you, and I loved you. The rest was simple." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. From inside the house came the sounds of their youngest grandchild, Elizabeth's daughter Emma, who was staying with them for a few weeks. Sarah smiled at the sound of the child's laughter, grateful for the full, rich life she had been blessed with. "I never thought I would be this happy," Sarah said quietly. "When I left Philadelphia all those years ago, I thought happiness was something that had been taken from me forever. I thought I would spend the rest of my life paying for my mistake." "Loving someone is never a mistake," James said firmly. "The man who betrayed your trust, he was the one who made the mistake. You just had the misfortune of choosing poorly. But look at what you have now, Sarah. Look at what we have built together. 5 beautiful children, numerous grandchildren, a home, a community that respects and cares for us. That is not the result of a mistake. That is the result of courage and determination and love." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She thought about all the twists and turns her life had taken, how a moment of poor judgment had led to disgrace and flight, but also, ultimately, to finding the greatest love of her life. If someone had told her, that day she stepped off the stagecoach in Sweetwater, that she would end up here, married to a wonderful man and surrounded by a loving family, she never would have believed it. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for everything." "No," James said, lifting her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for taking a chance on me. Thank you for trusting me with your heart and your son. Thank you for giving me the family I always wanted but never thought I would have. You are the greatest blessing of my life." As they sat together under the stars, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had left Philadelphia carrying another man's baby, terrified and alone, convinced that her life was over. But she had found James, or perhaps James had found her, and he had spoken those words that had changed everything. Then, "I will love you both the same." And he had. For nearly 3 decades, he had loved her and Benjamin with the same fierce devotion he showed their other children. He had built a life with her that was full of joy and purpose. He had proven every single day that love was not about biology or circumstances, but about choice and commitment. The years continued to pass, bringing new joys and inevitable sorrows. In 1910, Benjamin and Rebecca celebrated the marriage of their eldest daughter. In 1912, Thomas took over full management of the Crawford Ranch, as James finally retired at the age of 59. Mary Ellen's oldest son graduated from college and became a teacher like his mother. The twins, Samuel and Elizabeth, both married and started families of their own, giving Sarah and James even more grandchildren to dote on. By 1915, Sarah and James were in their 60s, their hair gray and their steps slower, but their love for each other as strong as ever. They had moved into a smaller house in Sweetwater itself, finding the ranch too demanding now that James was fully retired. Their days were filled with visits from children and grandchildren, with quiet evenings reading together, with walks through town, greeting friends and neighbors who had known them for decades. One afternoon, Sarah was sorting through old papers and came across a letter, yellowed with age, that she had written years ago but never sent. It was addressed to her parents in Philadelphia, a long explanation of everything that had happened, of why she had left, of the life she had built in Texas. She had written it during a particularly emotional moment years before, but had ultimately decided not to send it, afraid of opening old wounds. Now, looking at it with the perspective of age, Sarah felt a profound sadness for the girl she had been, so frightened and ashamed. She wished she could go back and tell that terrified young woman that everything would be all right, that she would find love and happiness beyond anything she could imagine. But of course, that was impossible. All she could do was be grateful for how things had turned out. James found her sitting with the letter in her hands, tears streaming down her face. He settled down beside her with a slight grunt, his knees not what they used to be, and put his arm around her shoulders. "What is wrong, my love?" "Nothing is wrong," Sarah said, leaning into his embrace. "I was just thinking about how far we have come, how much has changed since those early days." "We have had a good life," James said simply. "A very good life. The best life," Sarah agreed. "I would not change a single thing." "Not even the hard parts?" James asked gently. Sarah thought about that, about the pain and fear and shame that had driven her from Philadelphia, about the difficult years when money was tight and children were sick, about the losses they had endured along the way. "No," she said finally, "not even the hard parts, because they led me here, to you, to our family. They made me who I am, and I am proud of that person." James kissed her temple, a gesture he had made thousands of times over the years, but that never failed to make Sarah feel cherished. "I am proud of you too. You are the strongest, bravest person I have ever known." As the sun set over Sweetwater, Texas, Sarah and James sat together in their small house, surrounded by photographs of their children and grandchildren, by mementos of a life well lived, by the tangible evidence of the family they had created together. Outside, the world was changing rapidly, with automobiles replacing horses and electricity coming to more and more homes. But inside, in the quiet sanctuary of their love, time seemed to stand still. Sarah thought about that desperate young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Sweetwater all those years ago, carrying another man's baby and a heart full of fear. She thought about the cowboy who had offered her a ride, who had looked past her circumstances to see her worth, who had promised to love her and her child the same. And she thought about all the years between then and now, all the moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle that had woven together to create the tapestry of their life. "I love you, James Holloway," Sarah said softly, "more than words can express." "And I love you, Sarah Holloway," James replied, holding her close, "more than life itself." In the years that followed, Sarah and James continued to be pillars of the Sweetwater community, respected and loved by all who knew them. Their golden wedding anniversary in 1928 was celebrated with a massive party attended by what seemed like half the county. All 5 of their children were there, along with their spouses and children, and even a few great-grandchildren. Benjamin gave a moving speech about the incredible man his father was, and Sarah watched with tears streaming down her face as her firstborn son, now 50 years old and a grandfather himself, publicly acknowledged the love and devotion James had shown him throughout his life. James passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1932, at the age of 79. Sarah held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering words of love and gratitude for the 54 years they had shared together. The funeral was one of the largest Sweetwater had ever seen, with people coming from miles around to pay their respects to a man who had lived with integrity and kindness. Sarah lived another 8 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a matriarch who was revered and cherished by her large family. She spent her final years telling stories about James, about their life together, about the ranch and the early days in Sweetwater. She wanted to make sure that future generations understood the kind of man James Holloway had been, the kind of love he had shown, the kind of courage it took to look past convention and see the heart of a person. When Sarah passed away in 1940, at the age of 82, she was laid to rest beside James in the Sweetwater Cemetery. Their shared headstone bore a simple inscription: James and Sarah Holloway, beloved parents and grandparents, they loved well. At Sarah's funeral, Benjamin stood before the assembled mourners, now a man of 62 with his own grandchildren, and told the story his mother had shared with him years before. He spoke of how Sarah had come to Texas pregnant and alone, how James had fallen in love with her despite her circumstances, how he had spoken those transformative words, "Then I will love you both the same." And he talked about how James had kept that promise every day of his life, raising Benjamin as his own son with never a word or action to suggest he was anything less than a cherished child. "My father, James Holloway, taught me what real love looks like," Benjamin said, his voice strong despite his tears. "Not the easy love that comes when everything is perfect, but the hard love that chooses to see value and worth when the world says there is none. He loved my mother when she thought she was unlovable. He loved me when I was another man's child. And in doing so, he showed us all what it means to truly live with compassion and grace." The story of Sarah and James Holloway became part of the family lore, passed down through generations. Their descendants would tell it to their children, emphasizing the courage of a woman who refused to give up, and the nobility of a man who chose love over judgment. It became a touchstone, a reminder that family is not just about blood, but about choice and commitment and showing up every day with an open heart. In the decades and centuries that followed, as the world continued to change and evolve, the small cemetery in Sweetwater remained a place where descendants of Sarah and James would come to pay their respects. They would stand before that simple headstone and remember the story of how their family began, with a dusty road, a desperate woman, and a cowboy who looked at her and saw not shame or scandal, but simply someone worth loving. And in the end, that was the true legacy of Sarah and James Holloway. Not the ranch they had worked or the money they had saved or even the large family they had created, but the simple, powerful truth they had lived every day of their lives together. That love, real love, is not about perfect circumstances or easy choices. It is about looking at someone, truly seeing them with all their flaws and complications and history, and choosing to love them anyway. It is about saying in word and deed, "Then I will love you both the same," and meaning it with every fiber of your being. Their story became a testament to the power of redemption, second chances, and unconditional love. It showed that mistakes do not have to define a life, that shame can be transformed into strength, and that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones built not on biology, but on choice and devotion. Sarah had left Philadelphia believing her life was over, but she had found in the wild plains of Texas something far more precious than the conventional respectability she had lost. She had found a love that saw past her circumstances to her true worth, a partner who stood beside her through every challenge, and a family that embraced not just her but the child she carried. James had given her the greatest gift possible, the chance to start over, to build something beautiful from the ashes of her shame, to prove that one mistake does not have to determine an entire future. And Benjamin, the child who had begun his life as a source of fear and scandal, had grown into a man who embodied the best qualities of both his mother's strength and his father's compassion. He had been raised by a man who had no biological obligation to him, but who had chosen, every single day, to be his father in every way that mattered. And that choice, repeated over and over for decades, had shaped not just Benjamin's life, but the lives of all his descendants who followed. The Holloway family tree spread and flourished over the generations, branches extending across Texas and beyond. But at its roots was always that story: a pregnant woman seeking refuge, a cowboy who offered love without conditions, and a promise kept across a lifetime. It was a story of hope rising from despair, of love conquering judgment, of family being defined not by blood alone, but by the daily choice to show up and care and commit. In the small museum in Sweetwater that opened in the 1960s, dedicated to preserving the history of the town and region, there was a photograph of James and Sarah Holloway taken on their 50th wedding anniversary. In it, they sat side by side on their porch, James's hand covering Sarah's, both of them looking at the camera with expressions of deep contentment. Beside the photograph was a placard telling their story, edited carefully to protect Sarah's dignity, but conveying the essential truth that James Holloway had married a woman others might have judged and had raised her child as his own, and that their love story had become legendary in the community for its demonstration of true compassion and commitment. Visitors to the museum would often stop before that photograph, reading the story and marveling at the idea of such selfless love. In an age when families were often fractured and complicated, when judgment came easy and compassion seemed in short supply, the story of Sarah and James offered a different vision. It suggested that love could overcome almost any obstacle, that families could be built in unexpected ways, and that sometimes the most meaningful relationships were the ones that required the most courage to begin. And so, the legacy lived on, generation after generation, a reminder that, in a harsh and unforgiving world, small acts of great love could change everything. Sarah Mitchell had come to Texas carrying another man's baby, expecting nothing but hardship and isolation. James Holloway had looked at her and seen not a scandal, but a woman worth cherishing, and he had spoken words that would echo through time. "Then I will love you both the same." Those words, and the life they built together in fulfillment of that promise, became proof that redemption was always possible, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and that family, in its truest and most beautiful form, was about choosing each other every single day. It was a story that deserved to be told and retold, a testament to the best of what humanity could be when compassion triumphed over judgment and love conquered fear. In the end, Sarah and James Holloway had lived ordinary lives in many ways, working hard, raising children, facing the challenges that came their way. But in the most important way, their lives had been extraordinary because they had shown that love, true love, is not limited by circumstance or convention. It is boundless, transformative, and powerful enough to change not just individual lives, but the course of entire families across generations. That was their gift to the world, and it was a gift that continued to resonate long after they were gone. The simple, profound truth that when you choose to love without conditions, when you look past the surface to see the worth in another person, when you say, "Then I will love you both the same," and mean it with your whole heart, you create something that lasts forever.